All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Gorowski, and I'll be your host for today. We are into March, the first week back from March break for a lot of classrooms in Canada, as well as some classrooms who are on spring breaks in the US. It's great to have our classrooms back with us, and it's been another very busy week. We still have lots of events coming your way for the month of March. So if you visit exploringbytheseat.com, you can find the events coming up. And then over the weekend, we'll have a new newsletter come out, and that'll have a big selection of our April live lessons for classrooms. You can tune in live, catch the recordings, whatever works best for your classrooms. We just love to be sharing the best in science, exploration, conservation, and adventure with you. So coming up this weekend is World Water Day. It's a day we celebrate our blue planet, the fresh water, the salt water, that's so important to life on Earth, the incredible ecosystems that we have on this planet. And they are in danger as well. So we've been talking about things like glaciers. We've been talking about how important it is to share science communication about our oceans. And for our event this afternoon, we're going to spend a little time with Khaleel Arfeen. He studied geomatics and computer science and has a job as a physical scientist at the Canadian Hydrographic Service. So one of his main jobs is working with the Tide Science Group. So this means he studies how water levels in our ocean and lakes are changing over time. He also gets to work on projects with people from all over the world, including a special project along with the US to study water levels in our Great Lakes. So let me grab Khaleel here from backstage. Let's get him in. Hey, Khaleel, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Awesome. Well, Khaleel, so great to have you with us. This is one of our events. We work closely over the school year with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So we get to hang out with scientists, with researchers, with science communicators. So it's great to have you in that capacity, but also with World Water Day tomorrow. It's great to be thinking about all different aspects of water.
Yeah, well, we have a special presentation regarding water levels and how and why we measure them. So
perfect. Well, I am going to disappear in just a moment. We'll let you take over for a little bit. To our classrooms who are tuning in, don't be shy. Use the chat sidebar to send in some questions. We'll work those in when the time comes. But for now, Khaleel, let's let you take over for a bit and bring us into your world.
Excellent. So I'm just going to share my screen, and maybe Joe, just give me a verbal confirmation that you can see my opening slide.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it loading up. I'm going to bring it in. Looks good, Khaleel. We're ready.
Okay, awesome. So first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for this opportunity, Joe. I'm coming to you live from Ontario, Canada. So my presentation is entitled, What Are You Waiting For? The Exciting Work of Measuring Water Levels. So I'll just start off by giving you a quick background about myself. Oh, my slides are not working properly here. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. Okay, well, my first slide is not working on my bio, but I'll just explain it. So my background is my undergraduate was from the University of Waterloo, where I studied geomatics and computer science, and I did my master's degree in geomatics engineering at the University of New Brunswick. I currently work with the Government of Canada, specifically with the Canadian Hydrographic Service in the Tide Science Unit. And I'm a self-proclaimed nerd. I love to learn. So some of the things I love to learn about are philosophy, geography, space, computers, including AI and data. So I'm very lucky I have a job that helps me to really work with all my passions. So I'm excited to share more about this with everyone here today. Okay, so water matters, and it really does. So if you didn't know, Canada has the longest coastline in the world. It's about 243,000 kilometers. And this vast expanse of coastline provides diverse habitats for marine life and supports numerous economic activities such as transportation, fishing, shipping, and tourism. So this is where my job comes into play, understanding water levels in the country with the longest coastline. So here you can see I've attended conferences as part of work. We do a little bit of field work, dismantling and and setting up gauges. And then we also do field visits as well. So in the top right, this is a U.S. station when we're seeing kind of how they operate on the U.S. side, and this was at the Detroit River, one of the stations on the Detroit River. So let's just start off with what exactly are water levels. So water levels refer to the height of the water surface at any given time. Water levels and water in general are in a constant state of flux, meaning that they're always changing and dynamic in nature. And water levels are driven by hydrological factors. And in other words, these are natural forces affecting the water, which we'll explain next. So first, let's just talk about tidal and non-tidal waters. So waters can be identified as either tidal or non-tidal. And the difference here is that tidal waters are affected by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun, where we generally see waters rise and fall twice a day. So when you think of tidal waters, you should think of oceans, the sea, and estuaries. So non-tidal waters, on the other hand, are influenced by factors such as rain, snowmelt, evaporation, and wind. As a result, they're relatively stable and shaped by local conditions. So when you think of non-tidal waters, you should think of lakes, rivers, and ponds. So let's just talk a little bit more about the tides. So tides are the regular rise and fall of the ocean surface. They happen because of the moon's gravitational pull on the water, which creates a bulge on one side of the earth. So in this example, let's just eliminate the sun from this picture. Let's keep it simple. Let's just look at the earth and the moon at this point. So the earth has a gravitational pull, and that side is pulling. The moon is pulling the water from the earth towards it. And because of centrifugal force and the rotation of the earth, that creates a bulge on the opposite side as well. So these bulges are what we call high tides. And when the bulges move away from a certain location, the water level drops, and this causes low tides. So tides happen every day, and it follows a natural rhythm. So we have different types of tides. So we have high tides. So that's when the water level reaches its highest level during the tidal cycle. We have a low tide when the water levels recede to its lowest level. We have spring tides, which are extra high tides during the full or the new moons, because there's a strong gravitational pull. And we have neap tides, which are milder tides that exist during the quarter moons, whereas weak gravitational pull. So of course we omitted the sun from that, but the sun also plays a role here. And can you think of how the sun might influence the water levels and the tides with respect to the moon and the earth? So here's Bay of Fundy. So I live in Nova Scotia. I'm just presenting to you today from Ontario, but I live in Nova Scotia, and in Nova Scotia, we have the Bay of Fundy. So Bay of Fundy is home to some of the highest tides in the world. And let me just show you a video of this. Okay, so here are the tides rising and falling. So it's lowering right now, and if you've ever been to a beach, like a coastal beach, you can see this, but this is to the extreme here. And once you actually see this in person, it's quite amazing. But as you can see, the tides are like, the water continues to drop, and it's pretty unexpected. And then sure enough, we have our tidal cycle here, and they start to rise again. And the cycle repeats day in and day out. Okay, so tides are predictable. So tides are influenced by the gravitational forces related to the moon and the sun. Their behaviors is well established, and as a result could be fairly easily predicted. So I actually study mostly non-tidal waters. So non-tidal waters are generally pretty consistent and stable, but this is not always the case. So water levels on non-tidal waters are influenced by natural and non-natural influences. So natural influences could be high frequency events such as the weather events such as evaporation, wind, and rain. We have our medium frequency events such as river inflow, snowmelt, vegetation, and seasonality. Think of the water cycle for this. And then we have low frequency events such as glacial isostatic adjustment. Now we'll talk about some of these later on. But we also have non-natural events or anthropogenic events, influences, which are dams and reservoirs, damming and creating reservoirs on the waters and lakes, water extraction, land development, pollution, and sedimentation. These all, both natural and non-natural factors, influence water levels on non-tidal waters. So, again, my region in the Canadian Hydrographic Service is Central and Arctic, so I get to work with a mix of both tidal and non-tidal waters. I do primarily work with non-tidal waters, specifically in the Great Lakes, so a lot of the examples will be focused on the Great Lakes. So we don't have time to go into all the influencers of water levels, but we can go a little bit into some of them. So here is the process of glacial isostatic adjustment. So if we focus on the graphic on the left here, so we see that during the last ice age, the heavy ice loads the Earth's surface. And then as we move out of the ice age, the water starts, or the ice starts to melt, creates some water, and then as that loading on the Earth's crust becomes less, that crust starts to rebound back to its kind of natural state. And this creates, as you can see in the graphic on the right, some changes in the Earth's crust over time. So this is measuring the velocity of that crustal rebound over the year. So as you can see, we're at millimeter level. So in the kind of southwestern portion of the Great Lakes, we have up to 4 millimeters, negative 4 millimeters. And then in the kind of northeastern part of the Great Lakes, we have positive 3 millimeters. So we do see a tilting of one side to the other. And now this is relatively small, negative 4 millimeters to 3 millimeters. That's not technically a lot, but over time, and over a decade, these changes definitely add up. So we also have seasonality of the water level. So it's a medium frequency event, and this is great for illustrating kind of the water cycle. So water levels reach the lows in the winter as most of the water is locked on land and ice as ice and snow. Then spring arrives and begins to melt the snow and ice, and then they make its way into the lakes through the rivers. So we see an increase in water levels during the spring. And then this continues into the summer where the water reaches the maximum. Then it begins to decline in the fall where the temperature difference or the temperature gradient between the water and the air causes an increased amount of evaporation, leading to declining water levels. And then we make our way back into the winter where the cycle then repeats. Okay, so here we are going to talk about a high frequency event. And I'm wondering if anybody's ever heard of a seiche. So a seiche is a standing wave that forms in a closed or semi-closed water body, such as a lake, bay, or reservoir. So you can think of it as the sloshing of water in a bathtub. So water oscillates from one side to the other. And then these waves can last for minutes or even hours. Even maybe sometimes days as well, depending on the water body and the triggering force. So here we have an undisturbed bay in this case. So the next slide shows we have heavy winds coming in, and they push the water levels right to the side. So as you can see here, the water levels increase on this side and decrease on this side. So I'm going to go back and forth here. So you can kind of see how the wind kind of sets that up. And then the next step of this is that after the winds kind of subside, the waters are pushed over onto the one side, and then they come back, they slosh back onto the other side. And then how we'll actually see this in real life is we have a good example of this on Lake Erie. So this event happened in 2015. This was a seiche event. So here you can see that in red, we have our stations on the west side of Lake Erie. In green, we have stations in the kind of the middle of Lake Erie, and blue are our stations on the east side of Lake Erie. So as you can see, we had heavy winds that kind of pushed water levels, and this pushed it over onto the west side of Lake Erie. And there's a time difference between peaks here. And then that water levels, they moved all the way over to the other side of the lake. So they sloshed all the way over. And as a result, we saw this negative peak on the east end. And then that kind of reverberates back and forth, as you can see. So this is kind of how we can observe these types of events in real life. Okay, so where exactly do we measure water levels? So again, I'm focused on the Great Lakes. So here we have stations across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence system, where we collect water levels mostly across the shorelines in the interconnecting rivers and channels there. So here we have the US and Canadian permanent and temporary gauges. So a permanent station or gauge is it has a stilling well, and we can just show a picture here. So this is a permanent station right here. We have permanent enclosures here and inside of there we have a stilling well, which helps block out the high frequency variations of the water levels. And we collect data year round, and typically these stations have been around for decades. Now, on the other hand, our seasonal gauges, these are typically fixed to existing structures. There's no well, and we typically just deploy these for the warmer months. So in total, we have about 365 stations across the Great Lakes, including our temporary stations and our permanent stations. So how exactly do we measure water levels? Now, I don't have time to go through each and every single sensor that we use, but our two primary sensors used at our permanent and seasonal sites across the Great Lakes are both encoders, which is pictured right here on the left. So encoder is a kind of a float counterweight. Below that's the instrument right there, but below that is a well, is the well. And as the water levels rise and fall, that chain moves up and down, and we can record that on that red portion. That's the actual sensor right there, and we record the rotational movement, and we can then associate that with the distance to calculate how far the water levels have moved up and down. And then we also have radars here. So radars are devices which then sends a pulse, so a microwave signal downwards towards the water. That signal bounces back or reflects off the water surface, and then we can calculate the time that took and then infer the distance based off of that. And both allow us to measure the water levels at the surface. Okay, so what exactly is the importance of measuring water levels? So water levels help us in various ways. For example, they aid in coastal management by predicting and preventing floods. They protect the environment by monitoring habitats and managing flood risk. And the thing that the Canadian Hydrographic Service is mostly concerned with is ensuring navigational safety by helping ships avoid running aground. So we want to check when the water levels are at the lowest, and we want to be able to communicate that with people who are navigating these waters to allow them to know if they're at a risk for running aground. So if you never heard of a datum, I'll tell you a little bit about a datum. So imagine you're at the beach and you want to measure how high the water is, but where do you start measuring from? And how do you even measure it? Because there's multiple ways you can do that in multiple areas where you can measure the water levels from. And how are you going to keep that consistent if you come back a day or a year later and try to measure the water levels again? So that's where datums come in. So datum is like a starting point or a reference line that scientists use to measure things. For water levels, it's a specific point that everyone agrees on to start measuring from. This way, when we talk about how high or low the water is, everyone is using the same starting point, making it easier to understand and to compare. So think of it as like a starting line in a race. Everybody starts from the same place, so it's fair and clear who's ahead or behind. In the same way, a datum helps us to understand changes in water levels accurately. So as part of my project at work, I'm working on the International Great Lakes Datum Update of 2020. And it's a collaboration between the Canadians and the Americans to help ensure a fair sharing of resources in the Great Lakes. So we deploy seasonal and permanent gauges across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence system to help us measure the water levels. And then we meet, we collaborate, and we ensure that we're making proper use of our resources, including hydroelectric generation, including shipping, that type of thing. And we want to ensure that this datum is the same across US and Canada, because while we're two different countries, the lakes are shared. And as a result, we need to have a consistent datum in order to collaborate. So in conclusion, we talked about what water levels are, how water levels are measured, and why water level observations actually matter and their impact to our economy and lifestyle. So thank you very much. And I guess at this point, we'll do questions.
All right. Perfect, Khaleel. Thank you so much for taking us into your world a little bit, helping us learn a little bit more about water levels, why they're important, and just how you're keeping track of them. Obviously, whether it's the ocean or freshwater, it's important to know what's going on. And so in a minute, we're going to start some questions. So if there are the classrooms who are tuning in, if you want to send some questions in via the chat, we're going to work some of those in for Khaleel in a moment. But before we do that, while you were presenting, Khaleel, I pulled together a quick Kahoot quiz. So we're going to give students a chance to test their new water level knowledge. So bear with me for 1 second while I share my screen. It should pop up here momentarily. There we go. Perfect. And then I'm going to hit start. So there's a few ways you can join us today. If you head to kahoot.it, you can ask for a PIN number 1656732, and that'll bring you right in. You'll get an auto-generated animal name. If you don't have one-to-one tech at your seat, that's not a problem. Your teacher could pop this up at the front of the classroom, and you could shout out your answers to him or her. If you can't join with tech, that's no big deal. You can still play along and see how you do. So we'll give it about another minute to see if a couple groups will be able to come in here and join us. In the meantime, though, Khaleel, I will get things started with a question. And so how long have you been, since you've graduated, have you been out working in the field looking at water levels?
Yeah, so my job is primarily focused on the data aspect of things, on data science. So I'm mostly working from the office with the occasional going out in the field, but I've been with the CHS now for about 3.5 years now. So after I graduated, I kind of landed this job, and honestly, it's a great job. And like I said, it kind of touches on all my passions all at once.
All right. Well, it looks like we have some groups in here with us, which is great. So a few more popping in. So we'll give it another couple seconds. Maybe I'll take one more quick question here. This one's from the chat. And so you mentioned geomatics at the beginning, and this 4th grade class is wondering, they've heard of geography, but what's geomatics?
Right. So geomatics is concerned with, there's several aspects of geomatics itself. So it encompasses geodesy, which is kind of the measurement of the location on Earth. There's also like the ocean side of things, which is concerned with the depth and water levels in the ocean and in the lakes and rivers. So it's geomatics in general is just about kind of measuring and being able to locate and understand the physical properties of the Earth, including the crust and the oceans and the waters.
All right. Well, let's get in on this Kahoot action. Looks like things have slowed down a little, so I think we are ready to get started. There are 4 questions. Actually, no, I think I did 5 today. There's some true or false. There's some multiple choice. The quicker you put in the right answer, the more points you're going to get. So here we go. First question coming your way. A nice warm up. Which province is Khaleel joining us from today? Was it Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, or PEI, or Prince Edward Island? So Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, or PEI. Nice warm-up question to get us started, and then we will get into maybe a few more challenging ones for us. In between each round, we'll also get a checkup of the score, and there we go. Ontario, good job, crew. So that puts the Groovy Sable in first place. Let's go to a true or false. Canada has the 3rd longest coastline in the world. Is that true, or is that false, that Canada has the 3rd longest coastline in the world? You've got about 11 seconds left to lock in your answer. Canada, the 3rd longest coastline in the world. True or false? All right. Good job. False. A little bit higher under the false. We are the second biggest country, but we have the largest coastline in the world. You just have to look up north and you can see where we get a lot of that coastline from. Very cool. Let's go to the scoreboard. The decisive crane takes the lead. Another true or false coming your way. Tidal waters are influenced by the gravitational pull of the moon. Is that true or is that false? The tidal waters are influenced by the gravitational pull of the moon. We've got a few more seconds to lock something in. All right. True, absolutely. Good job, crew. Overwhelming true on that one. That puts the adorable koala into first place. Lots of movement up and down, but I guess a shout out to Red Yeti, who's had 3 correct answers in a row. Okay, extra high tides are they called neap tides, grand tides, big tides, or spring tides? So we have high, low tide in areas with coast, ocean coast every day, twice a day. But when it's extra high, is it a neap tide, a grand tide, a big tide, or a spring tide? All right, so the answer is spring tide. Let's jump to our leaderboard. The Diplomat Gator. We've got one more question to decide things. Why is it important to monitor water level changes? Is it predicting floods? Is it to help protect wildlife? Is it for navigational safety? Or is the best answer all of the above? So why is it important that we keep an eye on how water levels change? Is it to predict floods, to protect wildlife, for navigational safety, or all of the above? All right. Overwhelmingly all of the above. They are all correct answers, but all 3 of those are pretty darn good reasons why we should keep track of how our water levels change. So in third place, we've got the Smooth Ferret. In second, the Red Yeti. And holding down that top spot, the Diplomat Gator, holding on for the last 2 questions. All right, very cool. Well, thanks for playing along with us. I'm going to come back from that screen share. We will turn off the music and let's get to that Q&A action. So I already see some questions in the chat, but don't be shy to keep those questions coming. We've got at least 15 minutes that we can dedicate to some Q&A action. So let's take a look here. Okay, so you mentioned that if there were different types of equipment you use to measure and that some are temporary or put out at certain times. So why is it that they're not all permanent? Why are some only put out at certain times?
Right. Yeah. So great question. So it really comes down to a resource perspective, and it would be great if we can put permanent stations at every single location in the Great Lakes, but obviously we can't because of resources. So the temporary stations, they provide a good way for us to get data for locations that are harder to reach, or in between permanent stations where we can then get water levels and we can have a better understanding of the lake in general. So these temporary stations, they get put out seasonally during the warmer months, and we don't keep them running during the full year because ice builds up and we don't have dedicated infrastructure, because in the wells we actually have heat lamps that turn on when the temperature drops below 0 to help keep that well nice and toasty and above 0 so that the water actually doesn't melt. But if the water level if the water level starts creating ice, then that's a problem, and we're not actually able to measure the water levels accurately, right? So we need that open water without the ice there.
All right. I've got a question from some 6th graders here. Looks like they're joining us in Quebec, and they're curious about any trends you're seeing. You mentioned that you study the Great Lakes. Are we seeing any trends over time, either rising or lowering levels?
Right. Yeah. So there definitely is seasonality in the lakes, and there is definitely some changes in the lakes year over year as well. So kind of what we're seeing, at least from my analysis, I'm seeing that there's a clear shift from west to east in the Great Lakes. So I'm seeing that in a lot of the western side of the lakes in Superior and Lake Huron in Michigan, the water levels have started to fall, versus in the eastern part of Ontario, Erie, they started to rise. So yeah, we are seeing some changes, and also these are affected by factors you might not think as well, such as like monsoons and everything. Like the whole water cycle is all one system, and everything kind of affects everything else in one way or the other.
Yeah. I think we forget sometimes that the amount of water we have on Earth, that's what we've always had. It's recycled, it moves through the water cycle. So, I know a favorite one for classrooms is that odds are you're having a glass of water and it's gone through a dinosaur in the past, some of those water molecules. So, yeah, it moves around. Different things happening around the planet can impact it. Now, you mentioned, that was interesting, that difference from east to west. Do you guys have any theories or thoughts on why we're seeing that trend between the two different sides of the Great Lakes?
Yeah, so this is primarily associated with the datum and water levels above our datum, so our zero reference point, right? So there is definitely that one aspect of glacial isostatic adjustment and kind of the rebound of the crust, and just how exactly that's affecting. Because when we first established our datum, it was in around 1980s, right? So think about, we're 30 years plus from then, and that glacial isostatic rebound is about 4 to 3-4 millimeters every single year, and over time, over those decades, that adds up quite a bit, and that changes kind of our reference point for water levels, and exactly that influences how high the water levels are above and below that datum.
All right, so we've got a class of grade 6/7 book class joining us in Brampton, and they're curious about maybe if we can put some numbers to some of the changes you're seeing. So, maybe levels between, say, winter and summer, or even just maybe the difference that you're seeing between a little higher in the west and a little lower in the west and a little higher in the east.
Right. Okay. So, why don't I just try to pull up a graphic here, and
Sure.
maybe I can show you. All right. So just bear with me. But that's definitely a great question here.
All right. Let me know if you have any troubles with the screen share. And yeah, keep those questions coming, classrooms. I've got a few more good ones here that we're going to work in. But we do have time. We could squeeze in a few more if you pop them in to the chat. So we'll keep an eye out for a few more extra questions to go along with the ones we have so far.
All right. So I'm just about to share my screen.
Yeah, no worries.
Perfect.
Okay, I see it. Let me bring it in. Perfect.
Yeah, so this just kind of gives an illustration of kind of the changes of these two water levels compared to the datum on the Great Lakes here. So as you can see that we have that west-east variation, where we see water levels kind of these are water levels below the current datum, and these are on the western or the eastern side, we have water levels kind of rising above the datum there. So this just kind of gives a brief quantification of that. So we have about 20 centimeters as our biggest circle. So you can see where you see the big circles, that's about 20 centimeters, and then 10 centimeters for the medium-sized circles, and then 0 to 10 centimeters for those small circles here. So that kind of helps.
What period of time is this that we're looking at here?
Yep, this is data compiled from 1960 to 2024.
Okay, 20 centimeters. I mean, that's a pretty significant change, almost a ruler. So that's, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so water levels are changing. Like I mentioned, they are dynamic in nature, and that's why we need to measure them.
All right. So a follow-up to that question from our 6-7s. You mentioned as well that you work with partners on the US side and almost kind of keeping checks and balances that the resource is kind of being used fairly. So, what does that look like? What would be something that would be measured to kind of determine if the resource is kind of being used fairly by each side?
Yep. So at Canadian Hydrographic Service, that's our primary. So the IGLD is a large project with many organizations on it, including organizations from the U.S. and Canada, and multiple government organizations on these projects. So the Canadian Hydrographic Service is paired with NOAA co-ops, who are responsible, and we both are responsible for measuring water levels. So we're the actual ones going out and taking the water level measurements. And then with those water levels, we submit them daily and weekly to what we call regulation. So regulation, there are teams on both the US and Canadian side where they take these water levels, they compile daily means, monthly means, those types of things that allow us to decide how much water we divert for electric generation, how much ships can navigate, how much load ships can take in order to navigate the waters, these types of things. So we meet actually twice a year. It's called the coordinating committee meeting, and we discuss all this together. And there's multiple groups on this, like working groups. So we have our water levels working group, we have hydrology, we have our regulation working group, and we all come together to decide on kind of how the Great Lakes are looking and what we can do to help coordinate and continue to coordinate.
Yeah. And then I'm curious about, if maybe one side isn't kind of being as fair as the other, maybe. Is there penalties? Is it more of like, hey, come on, do better kind of thing? How are are these regulations enforced?
Right. So, I mean, luckily we've been pretty good in our cooperation. That has not come up, at least since I've been involved with this project.
Good.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if what would happen if the government agencies don't kind of cooperate. But at this point, we have a very great relationship, and we are cooperating quite nicely together.
All right. Hopefully, we don't have to find out because it is an important shared resource.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we talked, you're on this group working with the Great Lakes and really monitoring those levels. Is the same thing happening at the same time out on our ocean coasts, maybe trying to look at changes due to climate change, maybe rising sea levels?
Yep. So I do feel that there is a lot of coordination as well with the coastal side of it, but maybe not as much as the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because I mean, for coastal datums, so the primary purpose of this is to create the datum, which allows us to measure water levels from a specific point or reference point, right? So the Great Lakes are a closed system, and they are kind of a little smaller in nature, and they have quite a bit of presence from US and Canada because it's shared between both of us. Whereas the oceans are vast and everything. So there might not be as much coordination in terms of coordinating the data, but we do have different organizations that do help monitor this, such as National Resources Canada, which are looking at kind of like the ellipsoid and geoid type heights that these can coordinate between countries. So yes.
All right. Got a question here for some third graders out in Alberta, and they're curious about a natural disaster, something like an earthquake. Could that impact water levels?
Of course, yep. So if you ever heard of a tsunami occurs when there's an earthquake in the ocean, and that creates like a kind of a push, and that creates a big wave that then propagates throughout the ocean and eventually hits land. So we do have those definitely affect coastal waters. In terms of the Great Lakes, what we've seen is that some stations, they had mines or mining that has occurred, and that kind of shifts and unsettles the land. And as a result, some of our stations at the on top at the top of the ground, there it starts to either sink or move because of the mining has shifted the earth. So that's kind of a smaller example, but yes, that definitely affects the water levels.
All right. And then, so a question here about what we might see going forward. Obviously, we know a lot about climate change. We know that there's maybe a stress on water resources because, some areas are in drought and things like that. What do maybe you and your team think the future of our Great Lakes are going to be? Do we think we're going to see levels continuing to fall over the next few years? What's the best guess looking at the data so far?
I mean, we very well can see a great fluctuation. I wouldn't say that water levels, blanket term, they're either going to rise or fall. I think what we're going to see is a high variation year over year. Some years we might experience very low water levels, versus some years we might experience very high water levels. I think the extremes are going to be much more intense. Now, from the ocean perspective, I live in Nova Scotia, and we are seeing an effect of climate change and increasing water levels. And we are seeing that water levels are increasing, and that is affecting some people, especially those living around the coast. So.
All right. And I have a final question for you, Khaleel. This is from some 8th graders in Toronto. And the data that you collect, is it available kind of open source, like real time for people, or does it come out more in yearly reports?
Yeah, of course. So here, I'll share my screen again.
Sure.
So all the data that we collect is available to the public. So, and I'll just show you how to do that.
Yeah, great. Sounds good. I see it loading. Perfect.
Okay, so if you want to go and collect our data, you can go to tides.gc.ca. This is the federal government website and the CHS website. From here, you can go to tides and water level stations. I believe it's this. Let me just check. Yes, so you can see all the data from, well, you can first see all the stations across Canada, but let's just say you want to go into a specific station. You can then click on the station and view station data. And then from here, you can see all the data. You can change the timeline, that type of thing. You can export this to CSV. You can change the date that you want and the time zone, that type of thing. You can change your station right up here. So all the data we do collect is available for the public, and definitely encourage, if you're interested, go check out the data, plot it up, check it out, and you can do these types of analysis yourself.
Yeah, I liked that map that you just showed. It was really kind of neat to see the extent of kind of those monitoring stations kind of all across the country. So there's definitely a lot of capacity to kind of see what's going on and keep track of what's happening.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, I want to start off with a shout out to our classrooms. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for sending in those great questions. And of course, it's always great to play a little Kahoot and see what you've learned. And then Khaleel, thank you so much. I know you're a busy guy, and yeah, it was really nice to have you with us the last school day before World Water Day, and to share a little bit about the work you're doing, kind of keeping track of what's happening here in Canada.
Yep. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. If you can stick around at 2:00, today is World Glacier Day, so we're going to celebrate with Parks Canada. So we've got a cool event coming up at 2:00. Otherwise, you can catch the recording, or we'll see you in a future event. So thanks for hanging out, everyone, today. Thanks again, Khaleel.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.